election, coming soon, the assassination, an investigation into a true story that shook the world. A new podcast from the BBC World Service. Subscribe to The Assassination now, and you'll get every episode automatically.
This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of the 24th of December. I'm Claire McDonnell with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, more than 180 people have died after a tropical storm sweeps through the southern Philippines. Now concern turns to the plight of the living.
In this situation, there are big risks for children, risks of outbreaks of diarrhoea, waterborne diseases.
Charities working to get children with cancer out of a rebel-held area in Syria say they're heartened President Assad is considering their request.
The plan is that we will get to Ghouta as quickly as we can, get the children out. The prognosis, if they get the right treatment, most of them should have a full life, as it were.
Also in this podcast, scientists have captured the first footage of one of the world's rarest pigs.
We were looking through the videos, we saw some monkeys, some forests, and then we had the water pigs and was like, yeah!
And we remember Bruce McCandless.
There's a few millimetres basically between them and death. He was floating several hundred metres away from the space shuttle. If anything had gone wrong, that would have been it.
But first, the Philippine island of Mindanao is usually spared the major storms which regularly batter the nation. Not this time. It's been devastated by a tropical storm which officials now say, as we record this podcast, has left more than 180 people dead in the southern Philippines. Many people remain unaccounted for. Oliver Conway reports.
Rescue workers clear the wreckage of a wooden hut obliterated by a landslide in northern Mindanao as volunteers dig with their bare hands. But there's only despair for those watching as a lifeless child is pulled from the mud. The flooding was so powerful it brought down trees and swept boulders onto roads. Dozens of bodies were recovered from a swollen river. Disaster officials said many people had ignored warnings to leave coastal areas and riverbanks. Houses were getting flooded, said this local resident, but people got trapped by the strong waters and couldn't escape. They were swept away.
There were 103 houses dito, bahay.
Rescue worker Vic Ma said many houses had been destroyed by the floods.
So when the flash flood happened, wash out talaga lahat. We have 90 families evacuation center natin affected.
Andrew Morris of the UN Children's Agency UNICEF said 350,000 people in the worst affected area had already been forced to leave their homes because of recent fighting between government troops and Islamic militants, and they needed urgent help.
In this situation, there are big risks for children, risks of outbreaks of diarrhoea, waterborne diseases, the sanitation situation in those affected areas in North Mindanao have been particularly bad, and this has added risks.
The Philippines is hit by about 20 typhoons each year. Around 50 people were killed in another deadly storm just last week. In this latest disaster, as before, it is the poorest who have suffered most.
Oliver Conway reporting. Venezuela has expelled the Brazilian ambassador to Caracas and Canada's chargé d'affaires. The announcement was made by the head of Venezuela's powerful constituent assembly, Delcy Rodriguez.
We have decided to declare persona non grata to Canada's chargé d'affaires for his permanent and insistent, rude and vulgar interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela, and declare the ambassador of Brazil persona non grata until the de facto government restores constitutional order in this brother country.
Well, she went on to say Brazil's government had accused President Nicolás Maduro of constantly harassing the opposition and blamed Canada for imposing sanctions on a number of Venezuelan government officials. I got more from the BBC's Americas regional editor, Leonardo Rocha.
Relations with Brazil and Canada have been not good for a while. In the case of Brazil, what the Venezuelan government is referring to is the dismissal, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the left-wing Brazilian president, by President Temer. And that, at the time, prompted Venezuela really to harshen its opposition to its reaction to the opposition, because they described that as a right-wing coup, and the same thing was being plotted for Venezuela. With Canada, things haven't been going on for a while. They accuse them of being taking orders from the Trump administration. But what's interesting is we have presidential election next year is expected to be in the first half of the year, and President Nicolás Maduro is expected to run for another 6-year term. And shortly after that announcement, Delcy Rodriguez announced also the release of 80 political prisoners. The government doesn't call them political prisoners, but they've been arrested for being in the opposition. So it looks like they're preparing the terrain for the elections next year.
And yet, these actions build even more controversy, don't they, around Mr. Maduro's government at a time when he really needs to move away from that?
They do. I think Canada, in a way, is an easy target because they liken Canada with United States. The Temer government is unpopular, but to break relations with Brazil, which is the biggest country in Latin America, neighbor, to where many Venezuelans are migrating to in the economic crisis that Venezuela is going, isolates Venezuela even more. And it will create a very difficult situation for them. It looks like they decided to take a position and to align, get closer to their allies, which are Russia and the left-wing governments in the region.
Leonardo Rocha. There is a glimmer of hope that 7 children with treatable cancer may get the help they need to leave a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. A charity working with them in Syria has said that President Assad is considering their appeal. Our Arab Affairs editor Sebastian Usher reports.
For some of the children on a waiting list to be rescued from eastern Ghouta, it's already too late. The UN's humanitarian advisor on Syria, Jan Egeland, says access for evacuations has so far been denied.
We have already getting heartbreaking reports of children dying on this long list of medical cases for evacuation, but we cannot give up.
He blames the men with guns on both sides, while also suggesting that Iran and Russia, who wield huge influence on President Assad, could do more to help. What's needed is a ceasefire to allow ambulances and aid convoys in. But in recent weeks, the government bombardment has only intensified, even though the area is nominally a de-escalation zone. There may be hope, though. Hamish de Breton-Gordon advises a medical charity working in Ghouta. He helped get hundreds out of Aleppo last year in similar circumstances. He and a fellow advisor, Dr. David Knott, have just been in touch with Mr. Assad's private office.
We understand Assad is thinking about it, and we're calling him back on Tuesday morning to speak to him direct. And if he gives us the go-ahead, then the plan is that we will get to Ghouta as quickly as we can, get the children out. The prognosis, if they get the right treatment, most of them should have a full life, as it were.
The war for dominance in Syria may slowly be coming to an end, but its youngest and most vulnerable victims still need international help to ensure they survive to see the guns go quiet.
Sebastian Usher. A ceasefire has come into effect in South Sudan, the latest attempt to end the bitter civil war which has engulfed the country for the past 4 years. The deal was signed by the government and rebels in Ethiopia on Thursday. Julian Bedford reports.
At midnight local time, the warring parties in South Sudan ceased firing. The rebel leader Riek Machar promised his forces would remain in their bases and act only in self-defence. Government forces have received similar instructions. The UN says this latest truce is a last chance for peace in a country which was only created 6 years ago. But peace deals agreed between the two sides in 2015 and 2016 came to nothing, and the fighting has brought untold misery to all South Sudanese. More than 1 million have fled to neighbouring countries.
Bruce McCandless, who has died aged 80, is not a name that trips off the tongue when recalling illustrious American astronauts. And yet he earned his place in history when he made the first untethered spacewalk in 1984. There's an unforgettable photo of McCandless floating effortlessly through space, propelled by a jetpack, or MMU. His spacewalk took him 100 metres from the Space Shuttle Challenger, and back on Earth, after the flight, he told reporters that he hadn't been worried.
There is no up and there is no down in space. Once you're accustomed to seeing the Earth rushing by at 4 miles per second, and you concentrate on the orbiter and or the spas, your references at hand, you feel quite comfortable flying around at the relatively slow velocities with respect to them. It's sort of like two rather fast airplanes flying formation on one another.
Well, the US astronaut Michael Lopez Alegria, NASA's most experienced spacewalker, has performed 10 spacewalks during his career. And Bruce McCandless was his friend. He shared his memories of their friendship with the BBC's Julian Marshall.
Anytime you attach the word first to any sort of a space flight or airplane flight, it's always, there's a bit of daring do involved. But Bruce was very familiar with the equipment. He had a large hand in its design, and he probably knew it as well as anybody, so I'm sure that led to some comfort on his part.
But untethered, nothing between you and the spacecraft. I mean, psychologically, that, I would imagine, is rather unsettling.
Yeah, no doubt. The MMU was a very sophisticated machine. It had lots of redundancy, but at the end of the day, you are untethered, as you state, and that's exciting. Keep in mind that the shuttle could have rescued him if, the things didn't go quite right. The shuttle had a fair amount of maneuverability to go and fetch him. But I think it was probably pretty interesting to see the Challenger from that viewpoint 100 meters away, regardless of all that.
Spacewalking, tell me about it. A very different experience to walking on Earth.
Right. In fact, spacewalking is somewhat of a misnomer. We don't walk at all. We use our hands to propel us using handrails that have been pre-installed on the various vehicles. And so there's not much walking involved. But it's really an incredible experience that whatever you can say about spaceflight, which is already pretty superlative, is magnified. You're literally a human satellite with this spacecraft protecting you from the elements, and the view, your face being separated from literally the universe by this thin polycarbonate visor is it's pretty eye-opening. Of course, there's always work to do, and that's what we spend our time concentrating on. But nonetheless, when you can sneak a peek down at the Earth or at the stars, it's magnificent.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of MMU that McCandless used back in 1984, not used any longer in space.
That's right. When during the stand down after the Challenger accident, they sort of put their heads together and decided that it was too expensive to maintain and operate, especially in view of some of the other programmatic changes that happened during that stand down, which included not launching commercial satellites anymore, et cetera. So it's one of its important uses was to be able to go deploy or retrieve those satellites without using a robotic arm. And since we weren't going to be in that business anymore, they just decided that we wouldn't be using it. It wouldn't be worthwhile.
And the McCandless you knew, proud of what he had done?
So Bruce is an incredibly humble, just a nice guy, very laconic, very laid back. I got to know him quite a bit in the last few years. I'm the president of an association of space explorers, which unites over 400 astronauts and cosmonauts from all over the world. We have a Congress once a year, and he was a regular attendee. And I literally saw him 2 months ago and would not have suspected that he was ill in any way. But he's just a prince of a guy.
Michael Lopez Alegria. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And now Owen Bennett-Jones will tell you about another of our podcasts.
Our brand new podcast series, The Assassination, is about an unsolved murder with global ramifications. It's an investigation into the assassination of one of the world's most prominent politicians, Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto. Subscribe now and you won't miss episode 1. Search for The Assassination where you get your podcasts.
Still to come on the rest of this edition of the Global News podcast, the award-winning musician who plays the violin despite severe disability.
I play the violin up and down like a cello. I play this string a lot more than I play this string. This is the G, the low G. But if it was up on my shoulder, the easiest one for me to reach would be that one.
But before that, there are new claims that the number of dead in the Tiananmen Square massacre was far higher than that stated originally by the Chinese authorities. In 1989, China experienced several weeks of pro-democracy political protests, which culminated with a march in Tiananmen Square in central Beijing. Now, a secret cable has emerged, which was sent at the time by the British ambassador to China. John McManus reports.
On the night of the 3rd of June 1989, Chinese soldiers moved into Tiananmen Square in Beijing to clear a months-long protest that was proving a major embarrassment to the government. The crackdown was brutal. Troops used live ammunition and armoured personnel carriers to mow down those who stood in their way. There was worldwide condemnation, but the number of victims has always been disputed. Documents released from the UK's National Archives and seen by the French news agency AFP show that Britain's ambassador to Beijing at the time, Alan Donald, told the British Foreign Office the day after the massacre that at least 10,000 people had been killed, a number which he said came from a member of the State Council. Mr Donald also passed on horrifying details of the army's assault, saying that vehicles ran over the bodies of protesters several times, with the remains collected by a bulldozer, incinerated and then disposed of down drains. Wounded students who begged for their lives were bayoneted, while army medical staff who tried to give first aid were shot at. 3 weeks later, Alan Donald sent another telegram to London, revising down the number of dead to around 3,000. Only China, though, knows the true figure, and it maintains only 200 died.
John McManus. A deadly wildfire, which has destroyed more than 1,000 homes and other buildings in California, has now become the largest fire in the state's recorded history. More than 8,000 firefighters have been tackling the fire, amongst them thousands of prisoners, as our correspondent James Cook explains.
California has 4,000 inmate firefighters, men and women. For weeks now, they've been out in the burning brush, sawing, hiking and hauling, cutting fire breaks, saving homes. It's risky. 2 inmates have died this year, but there are rewards too, in reduced sentences and a sense of purpose.
It's better than twiddling my thumbs in the jail doing nothing, you know.
Helen Chung is serving a 16-year sentence for selling drugs.
Oh, yeah, definitely. This is a life-changing experience. It's very humbling. Also, we learn how to physically train ourselves, mentally train ourselves. We can accomplish anything that we put our minds to. We could do whatever we want to do in life, you know, and after being in this program, I feel like I've been rehabilitated and I feel like I can go out there and achieve anything I want to because I've done this. This is so hard.
Good? Yeah. Ms. Chung lives with around 56 other inmates in a prison camp near Malibu on the Pacific coast. There are no walls or fences here and no place on the program for violent or volatile prisoners or arsonists.
I've never pushed myself as hard ever in life as I do here.
Latoya Nahar is serving 4 years for causing the death of her 7-year-old son in a drunken car crash.
The attraction for me was because of my crime. I could come out here and do something positive and just get my head out, like when I'm hiking, thinking about, you know, things I could do. It's challenging mentally to get over something. I'm never going to get over it, but to try to ease my mind, and this has helped.
Many of the women in the camp grew up in the city. Hiking into the wilds is a big change, says Kenesha Byers, who's doing time for assault.
It's really hard. Sometimes you're up all night, and sometimes we even sleep on the mountain. It was a lot different being up on the mountains and hiking a lot and just seeing different animals and being around like rattlesnakes and, you know, all these different animals. It's like, oh my gosh.
There have been inmate firefighters in California for decades, saving the state millions. Critics call the project slave labour, but it is voluntary, it may reduce reoffending, and for Helen Chung at least, it provides some measure of redemption.
Everyone's like, "We love you, firefighters," and we all wave back and we wave to the kids. It's amazing.
A very small number of inmates have gone on to be firefighters when they're released. Latoya Nahar hopes to join them. Is this something you'd think about even when you finish your sentence?
Yes.
Really?
It is. I do have a grandfather who's a retired fire chief, and I think he'll be pretty proud of me to go through something like what I did and go out and do something positive with my life.
And do you want to be a firefighter?
Sure.
when you finish?
Yes.
In the civilian world, yeah.
Yes. And so does my son.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
James Cook with that report. The Zimbabwean general who led the military takeover that resulted in Robert Mugabe's resignation has now been appointed a deputy leader of the governing ZANU-PF party. Constantino Chiwenga recently retired as army chief. Mary Harper reports.
Like President Mnangagwa, retired Army General Chiwenga used to be one of Robert Mugabe's right-hand men. He played a central role in the seizure of white-owned farms and a brutal crackdown on the opposition after elections in 2008. He's almost certain to become one of Zimbabwe's vice presidents. Some ask how much the leadership style will really change under the new dispensation. But retired General Chiwenga is said to be committed to rescuing Zimbabwe's economy.
Mary Harper. Now, scientists have captured the first footage in the wild of one of the world's rarest and some might say ugliest pigs. The Javan warty pig is under such threat from hunting and habitat loss on the Indonesian island that some thought it could have already been driven to extinction. So, what do we know about this elusive pig? And if it's that elusive, how did they manage to capture it on camera? Here's our science reporter, Victoria Gill.
It's only endemic to Java. It's a real sort of local and quite amazing looking species. A lot of people describe them as very ugly. They've been called the ugliest pig in the world. They've got these huge warts on their faces, the males do. So the researchers were actually following up on a study that was done quite a long time ago, about 12 years ago, which was the last survey of Javan warty pigs, which is where they really found that in these very fragmented patches of forest, they had very few sort of reports of them from local people. So they made an estimate that the population had declined by 50% in the last 2 decades. And this was a follow-up on that. And they really thought that since they hadn't even been searched for that long, and any anecdotal reports of them had been so few and far between, that they might have gone completely.
You were out there when they were going to these quite elaborate lengths to find these pigs. Just talk us through what they had to do.
There's some groups out there who are working really hard in Java to try and protect habitat and local wildlife, which is under a lot of pressure from just an expanding human population, urban and agricultural development. There's very, very little pristine forest left. This team, they wanted to see if they could find where the strongholds of these animals were, if there were any left. But they're so secretive and they hide away in the undergrowth so much that what they have to do is trek into these patches of forest, and they have to hide just a network of cameras in the forest that are motion activated to see if they could spot them, and they did. So Dr. Joanna Rode-Margono, who led this study, just explained to me what an incredible treat it was for them to see the results.
We were looking through the videos, we saw some monkeys, some forest, something, and then we had the warty pigs, and was like, yeah! It was really fantastic and really good footage. Like, the photos showed the big wars as well, so that was really good.
Because they are so shy, it's really hard to count them. You can see in the footage on the BBC News website just how sort of secretive, and even when they nose near the cameras, they back off quite quickly. So it's not known how many there are, but it's clear that the density of that population is getting thinner and thinner. And the researchers only found these populations in 3 of the 7 places that they searched. And where they were looking were places where sightings of pigs had been reported by local people and by hunters as well. And also that were really ideal habitat for these animals. So it's clear they're still under a lot of pressure. They're really diminishing.
We're calling them the world's ugliest pig because they're small, they're brown, they're warty. But, I mean, it's very subjective, isn't it, that term ugly? What do the locals over there think of them?
Well, you see, this is actually a real problem because Indonesia is a Muslim country. There's not a very high regard for the pig in general. Also, they're hunted because they're pests. They take people's crops. So not only are they not one of the most photogenic inhabitants of Indonesia, but they're also not held in very high regard. So one of the things that conservationists at a wildlife refuge where they're actually breeding these pigs and they're really leading the sort of fight to protect the Javan water pig is this site